Thank you for joining us today. The program is about to begin. Please make your way to your seats and silence your cell phones. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and glad to see you here. I'm Alice Park, Senior Correspondent at Time, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this discussion with, on the far left, Dr. Pam Sharma, Director of Scientific Programs at the Jim P. Allison Institute at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And to her right, Ann Wojcicki, CEO of 23andMe, who I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with if you've sent in your sample.
Yes.
So I think it's clear from even just being here this weekend that we are really at the dawn of a new era in genetic medicine. A lot of excitement going on, and that's especially true in cancer, where we're starting to see the potential and the promise that people have talked about for so long in genetics starting to come to fruition. So I'd like to start with you, Ann. You founded 23andMe back in 2006.
Yep.
And it was a very different time then, but you saw the vision for what genetic information could do and what arming people with knowledge about their genetic makeup could do. But in some ways, do you think you were a bit ahead of your time and the company was a bit ahead of its time in terms of the information that you provided and what people could then do with it?
Yeah, look, in the earliest days, and there's many great leaders in here, like Francis Collins and others, who pioneered this path of genetic information and all the things that you can do with it. When 23andMe started, it was highly controversial, largely because it was direct to consumer. So this idea that I was going to give potentially medical information directly to individuals without a physician, without a genetic counselor, that you would even be able to download your raw data. There were aspects of 23andMe that were really controversial, like our consent form. Were you allowed to consent online? And now we're so used to DocuSign and other means of consenting that it seems almost silly that was a debate, but that was highly debated. And so this idea is like, if you got your whole genome, what were you going to do with it? Was it reckless for us to give out this information? And I would argue there's always been this debate about what can you do with your genetic data. And I think one of the worst things that's happened over the last 18 years was this idea of recreational genomics. Like that was one of our competitors that coined that term, and I think it was actually one of the most detrimental terms for this industry because it made people think as like, oh, these things are just for fun. But 23andMe has always returned results like your cystic fibrosis or a BRCA result or knowing if you're higher risk for colon cancer. And the idea that some of that's just sort of for fun, even some of the things that are for fun, like cilantro, like it's not recreational in that capacity. Like it's all information about you. And I think that when we started the company, there was always this information where you could get it and you can learn about risks. And one of the biggest challenges, 18 years later that I look at is the healthcare system is really not structured in any capacity to think about prevention. So even there was somebody just talking to me earlier about something like Alzheimer's. Like we've known the Alzheimer's genetics, ApoE4 for a while, but the healthcare systems today, the payers, the providers, everything is not set up really to help you think about prevention. And so that is one thing that I have been really passionate about since that day one is what are those ways I can arm people on their own to get access to their genetic information and for all of us to own really like the prevention. What can you do? What can we all do to be healthier? And there was a little bit of, after my 10 years of investing and knowing the healthcare system, a little bit of this recognition. I think it's really hard for the healthcare system to change and to ever adopt a system that's focused on prevention. And that's largely because of how much patients switch insurance, the various payers. It's when they get onto Medicare. Who's paying the bill is a hotly contested discussion. So no one wants to pay. And it's always that question of like, well, what's the cost of you getting this information, the preventative actions, and am I actually going to reap the rewards of preventing that disease? So I'm a firm believer that genetic testing for the foreseeable future is going to become part of a direct-to-consumer world. We're hoping more and more to partner with groups like MD Anderson and other groups out there when people can follow up and they find something like a BRCA mutation. But I think that's one of the key challenges that we've had is like, that acceptance of a direct-to-consumer world as well as this sense of prevention and how can a consumer own that, knowing that it's largely not financed by the existing medical world.
But even beyond the way our healthcare system is set up and, it's kind of biased against prevention, do you think the data that you were providing, like has the industry and has the medical community been there and was it there at the time back in 2006 to really know what to do with that data? Putting aside the way our healthcare system is structured, I think BRCA is a good example, but even then we know so much more now, right, about what to do with a BRCA result than we did in 2006. So do you think it was a little bit early in terms of, saying here's the information, even though we don't exactly know what to do with it?
I would argue, so one, there were companies like Myriad that had already been on the market for 10 years, and BRCA testing was out there. It was not largely accepted necessarily, but BRCA testing was out there, and there were groups like as somebody who got pregnant around that time, and I was asked to do genetic testing. I'm of Jewish descent. So I would argue that I was proactive in my asking for genetic testing. I was given a genetic panel, and then I found out from my sister who had gotten an expanded panel that she was a carrier for Blooms. That had not been in my panel. So it made me realize that there is actually a lot of actionable information that's out there that people do know how to work with and how to respond with, but it was not proactively given to everybody. So for instance, today, it's still a mystery to me why we know, about cystic fibrosis testing and carrier screening in general, but most pregnancies today are still not screened. To me, it's like unbelievably fathomable. Like, why don't we just proactively test individuals, or the Ashkenazi Jewish population, where we know that there are strong genetic associations with breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and that there's genetic conditions that could be passed down to children. Why don't we all proactively screen? So I 100% agree that the medical world wasn't ready, right, back then, but there were genetic counselors, and I think that's also where I have discovered more and more, like we now have 9 FDA authorizations that have proven out that the individual, the consumer, is far more capable of understanding medical information than we have ever really assumed. Like if you look at the history of healthcare, back in the 1950s, there's a JAMA paper about would you even tell your patient they had cancer? Yeah. And it was like, no, 90% of physicians said no. So the world has really shifted with respect to how much we respect all of you to be capable of understanding medical information. And so I think that's where we were a real leader and pioneer in saying, I actually believe if you give the right kind of structured content, people are actually capable of getting this information, understanding it, and knowing what to do with it. And the 9 FDA authorizations we have now show that we have reached comprehension at a 90% level at an 8th grade education level, that 90% of people can pass a pretty complicated set of comprehension about the information we've delivered. So I do believe people are far more capable than we ever assume. I definitely think we were early with all of that, but I think that in this world where technology is coming, if you want to get that out more and more to individuals, we have to think about innovative ways to deliver new technologies to individuals that are not predicated on a one-to-one interaction with a physician. Like, imagine if we all still had to book hotel reservations through the front desk. Like, that's healthcare right now. Yeah. Like, it's crazy. So that's part of what is going to have to change. And again, I'm sure we'll get into it, the world of AI. Like, I think those are some of the things that will also start to change. But we all know there's a huge shortage of genetics expertise. So that's part of what we also are now thinking about. We now have a genetic health team. We have medical providers. We are absolutely thinking about how you deliver genetic care, preventative focused genetic care at scale, because there is a shortage in this world about leaders who know how to actually deliver that information and how to help an individual take advantage of all that information.
And Pam, a lot of that information that Ann is talking about has to do with cancer and cancer risk. And cancer's really been transformed, I think, by genetics. So not only do we now know about an individual's genetic makeup, we're also analyzing tumors, and they're kind of getting their dossier, their genetic dossier. How would you say genetics has transformed the way you think about cancer and when you see patients now, or even when you think about kind of the best ways to treat patients?
Yeah, I think the entire field of oncology has had multiple times where it's changed, and cancer care has changed as a result of it. I think for a long time we were in the realm of thinking of the cancer of where it originated. Is it a bladder cancer? Is it a breast cancer? Is it a pancreatic cancer? The genomic and genetic testing in that era, the genomic era, really showed us that you can not only think of the cancer where it originated, but what's the genetic makeup of the cancer? What's the genomic profiling? And then you can apply that across multiple cancers. And so we had things like BRAF mutations, which were then said, if you have a BRAF mutation, we can target with a BRAF targeted agent. If you have an NTRK mutation, we can target with an NTRK targeted agent. All of these things really had us change our thinking in about cancer. It's not just where it originated, it's about the genomic profile that the cancer has with it. Take that now with the next era in oncology evolution, which is immunotherapy. And the fact that immunotherapy is not even targeting the cancer cells. Immunotherapy is targeting the patient's own immune system. And then the immune system, with the soldiers of the immune system, the T cells, the B cells, the dendritic cells, these are all the cells that will then form that army and then attack the cancer to get rid of the cancer. Immunotherapy has shown us that we can take patients who have stage 4 cancers with disease throughout the body, and the immunotherapy works to get rid of all of the cancer. And we can actually use the word cure in the setting of stage 4 disease for the first time. And so when you bring these two pieces together, the interaction between genomics and immunology really has now strengthened how we select patients. Because the immune system, as you can imagine, your germline DNA is actually encoding how your immune response is going to be. The immunotherapy that has to then be given, it can be dependent on what we understand about the host immune response. And I think these are the pieces that we're starting to see come together for us to really revolutionize cancer care and take it away from these broad drugs that are just designed based on, well, is this a bladder cancer or is this a breast cancer? And more designed on what is the genomic profile and what is the patient's genetic information telling us that we can then choose as the right treatment for them.
Now, you head up the Jim Allison Institute at MD Anderson, and of course, Jim won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the checkpoint inhibitors, which for me, the easiest way to think about it is inhibiting the inhibitor, right? And just allowing the immune system to do its thing. I wonder if you can describe for us a little bit, how different people's immune systems are and how good we are at understanding who will respond and whose immune system will respond and whose won't, or, the different degrees to which people respond.
Yeah, I think this is a great question because you're all sitting in here with the basic principles of your immune response working in the same way, right? The immune system is such a powerful, we like to think of it as a superhero of your body, right? It is so powerful that were you to develop a viral infection at this point, your immune system will go exactly into the same pathways that we each have, meaning that the innate immune response will take up a piece of that virus, it will then present it, it will process it, it will understand that it doesn't belong there, it will give the right signals then to the soldiers of your immune system, which are the T cells. And then that interaction allows the T cells to say, this doesn't belong here. I can now replicate multiple times and form the army. And then I will go in and eradicate everything that's there that does not belong there. Because your immune system is coded to you. It understands what is self and what is not self. So when something comes in that's not self, that immune system will then start a process. It is the same process in each of us. The innate immune response will communicate with the adaptive immune response, and the T cells will go and do their job, or the B cells will make antibodies. That, understanding the biology of that process is what Jim Allison was able to do. And by showing that this process has on and off switches, because you don't want the immune system to keep going forever. You need off switches to control the immune response. And Jim identified those off switches and said, in cancer patients, we don't want the immune response to stop. In cancer patients, we want the immune system to keep going to eradicate the cancers. And so we will block the off switches. And that's what you mean by inhibiting the inhibitor. And so for us, that's a broad concept that we can apply to many patients. And that's why we have FDA approvals of these immune checkpoint therapy drugs across so many different tumor types, right? We have FDA approvals in lung cancer, and melanoma, and breast cancer, and the list goes on and on. So I think that's because of the basic principles that guide all of our immune response. Now, having said that, each of us also is an individual. And when the tumor develops in each of us, it has individual characteristics within the genomic profile. And each of us has ways in which our innate and adaptive immune response will react, whether it'll be a hyper response or needs less of an activation stimulus. Understanding those pieces is where now the individualized or personalized therapy comes into that. So not everyone's tumor is going to have T cells that infiltrate. Some tumors don't have any T cells going in because the tumor has found a way to block the T cells. And when we know that, we can then come up with different combination strategies that allow us to then say, okay, not only do we have to give the inhibitors for getting the T cells to work, but we also have to give drugs that allow for us to get some T cell infiltration. And then some tumors have lots of antigens, right? So that's what we call these neoantigens, or high tumor mutational burden, because they have lots of antigens that can be presented to the T cells, and that gets the T cells going. And that's what led to the FDA approval, which was the first agnostic, tumor agnostic approval, right? Thinking about
and
the
that's
genomic.
huge, right?
That's
the
huge.
idea that, as you said, we're no longer, because I think drugs have traditionally, as they go through the FDA, the studies and the indication, for the label is like, this is indicated for people with breast cancer, for people with bladder cancer, whatever it might be. So to have this agnostic approval and recognition by the FDA really represents, I think, a sea change.
And
in the way
based on
cancer.
genomic information.
Right.
So that is where I see this intersection is so powerful. And the more data that we can collect about these things, actually, the better our drugs will be. I mean, it just makes so much sense that we just have to keep getting that information, understanding the information, and then using that to really personalize each patient's drug therapy and response.
Right, and as you said, the more data, the better, right? And the better we get. So, and that's your specialty.
Data. We like
in
data.
terms of the data, and that's what you have at 23andMe. As you see this evolution and, sort of the immune therapy take off in oncology and the different now targets, are you changing your panel? How are you adapting and incorporating these changes into kind of what you then feed back to consumers who come to 23andMe?
We've focused, so we have two aspects that I can answer the question about. So one is our drug discovery side, and then also how we use our data for cancer. So we have over 15 million customers. Over 80% of people opt into research, and they elect to say, yes, I want to participate, and then they self-report. So we ask them lots of questions about themselves. They are remarkable how much data they provide to us, and then we're able to use all of that data in these things called genome-wide association studies. So we have been able to leverage all of that data we have to create something called polygenic risk scores. So polygenic risk scores are really where you can look at thousands of genetic mutations, and you can put people almost on like a bell curve. Where are you on a risk score for something like colon cancer, breast cancer? And if you're on the tails, it's almost like it's a monogenic risk. I mean, it's almost like a BRCA mutation. It can be a really high risk for having something like colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer. So we're starting to look at those, when you can do these polygenic risk scores, and we can leverage all of our data to create this for all these different common diseases. So we're starting to roll that out in cancer, as well as a number of other cardiac conditions and other types of conditions. So that's one, is us giving this information to individuals, leveraging all the data. And again, thinking about that world of prevention, it's a beautiful sunny day outside. How many people would elect to say, yes, I'd rather do a colonoscopy or a mammogram than go on this lovely hike? Like, it's hard to get people to do preventive care. It's not fun. Like, I'm in that age bracket now. Like, I feel like it's all the time. So how do you motivate people? And I think if you can show people that data, these polygenic risk scores, and say, hey, like, you really have this exceptionally high lifetime risk, I think we can have a better chance of motivating people to comply with some of that prevention. And as we all know, it's much better for all of us to prevent disease than it is to necessarily treat it. So we think a lot about that in the world of prevention, providing those reports back. So we also leverage our data for drug discovery. And it's really interesting what we were able to see with respect to cancer. And we didn't anticipate doing cancer research because we don't have tumor data. So when you're doing drug discovery, usually you want cancer data, cancer tumor data, as well as your regular normal data, your normal genome, your germline. So what we found, though, is looking at people who have autoimmune diseases, they essentially have, almost an overactive immune system. And those people had less basal cell carcinoma, other types of skin cancers. So it was really interesting to see is that people with autoimmune have lower cancer risks. So we were able to look at, mutations in PD-L1, which is one of, the main immunotherapy drugs, targets. And we were able to identify a signature, a genetic signature, where people with specific mutations in PD-L1, have a higher likelihood of autoimmune disease and lower incidence of basal cell carcinoma. And then we were able to look across all of our genetic results and see, well, what other genetic mutations have similar types of signatures? And we were able to find a number of potential immuno-oncology targets. So we have 2 now in the clinic, one that targets CD200 and another that targets ULBP6. And both of those have these signatures that look very similar to CTLA4 and PD-L1, so the 2 big immuno-oncology drugs out there. So that signature has given us that confidence that we should move into the clinic. We're in phase 2 with one program and phase 1 with the other. So that's how I think we can start to leverage that data. There are reports coming out that are really interesting on polygenic risk scores for responding to IO drugs. That is a really interesting area as well when we think about drug response in general. There's a number of genetic associations with therapies like statins or, a lot of the antidepressants. So will there be a genetic germline test at some point to see whether or not you're likely to respond to a, immunotherapy? I think that's going to be likely as well in the future.
So when you talk about being in phase 1 and phase 2, are you collaborating with researchers or conducting clinical trials yourself?
We are, we have a number of different sites, so by definition, we have to be collaborating. We actually have one site is MD Anderson.
Okay.
So we have our own drug discovery team. A lot of people don't realize this about 23andMe. We have 23andMe, the consumer side, but we also have 23andMe Therapeutics. That is a number of people. It was started by Richard Scheller, who ran R&D for Genentech for 15 years. So we have started that. We have a number of programs. We had a large collaboration with GlaxoSmithKline. We had over 50 programs come out of that. But we have 2 wholly owned assets that we are moving through the clinic. So that's the CD200 and the ULBP6 in phase 2 and phase 1.
So Pam, I want to ask you, as Anne was describing, the information that we're beginning to see come out of even like consumer-based companies like 23andMe, does it matter where the genetic information comes from? Because I know academic centers like MD Anderson probably do a lot of genetic sequencing yourselves, both of patients' cells as well as tumor cells. So at this point, does it matter where it comes from, and does it matter to patients?
I don't think it matters to the patients where the genetic information is coming from. I really do think we do a lot of research work at MD Anderson. Obviously, we're an academic institution, and a lot of academic research programs are doing a lot of the sequencing on their own. as well. But I do think that there are now these companies, 23andMe being one of them, but there are other companies out there that are doing all of the sequencing. We can send the tumor biopsies, or we can send blood to get the germline DNA to compare between the tumor and germline to make decisions about what's the mutation call that we have to look at, or what's the targetable mutation that we have to look at. So I don't think it matters to the patient. And now there are these FDA-approved panels. Obviously, when you're looking at an FDA-approved panel for mutations, you only have certain mutations. I agree with Anne that you don't just want a small number. You want as much data as you can get, because although there might be some that have FDA-approved drugs, that's why you're looking at these small numbers of mutations, because there are drugs that we can use. I think there are lots of drugs coming that can actually be used to target other mutations that may not yet be on these panels. And the more information we have, the better it is for us to then say we can move forward in this path to develop this next agent. And I really think the important piece too is having longitudinal data. Because I think at some point we're having a lot of single time point data, and that may not give us all of the information. Because again, cancer by itself means that it's constantly mutating. The genetics are changing within the cancer. So if we have longitudinal time points and longitudinal data sets, we can start to predict actually which combination to give up front before we see some of these mutations come about. So I think these are the things that we're looking for. But for me and for my patients, I don't think it matters where we get that information.
And Anne, you mentioned that. So there's 23andMe has 9 FDA-approved panels?
Yeah, and they're broad approvals. So for instance, we'll have one for a class, like genetic health risks, meaning we got an approval, but so long as we follow the protocol and we do our validations, then, and that's analytical validation as well as clinical validation, then we can release new reports. So now we have over 150 or so reports out there. So, one of the big issues we have is we deliver so much content to individuals. It is a lot, which is part of why we did acquire a company so that we have a medical group now. And when there are people who find they have something like TTR amyloidosis or a BRCA mutation, we can help them now navigate that path as to what do they want to do, how do they want to think about it. Questions like IVF, like do they want to consider that? For ApoE, the Alzheimer's variant, what are some of the things you can do that are very lifestyle focused? So we have that ability now to help people. But your question was interesting in terms of getting, where do physicians want patients to get their data? One thing that's really interesting is the genetic industry is really in turmoil. So there's a company called Invitae, which is an amazing company, but they really suffered at the hands of payers. So of only 30 to 40% of people who were getting the test were actually getting that test paid for by their payers. So Invitae does something called indication-based testing, which is like if you have breast cancer and you want to do a really deep dive and look for various mutations, you do an indication-based test. 23andMe is a screen. We're not necessarily saying, oh, you have breast cancer. We're a population-based screen. So, but it shows the issue that someone like Invitae had. These are people who have a very good reason to get a genetic test, and only 30 to 40% were getting that test paid for. So I think that physicians are really in a difficult situation because they often want to get genetic testing, but it's not paid for. And we find that what 23andMe can do is that we almost become a workaround. So we're easy, we're accessible, we're affordable, it's under $200, people can get our information. And once you show up at a clinic with a BRCA mutation or other mutation, you know what to do. You absolutely, but getting that information is a huge hurdle. So we find that there is actually now like a real opportunity for physicians to be embracing a direct-to-consumer world where individuals can get this information. 23andMe is starting to talk to some of the EMR companies. Are there ways for consumers to upload that information, or ways that MD Anderson could even input that information directly? But I do think that the physician world's in a real difficult situation because they know that patients are not likely to get their test paid for, so it's probably just easiest for them to pay out of pocket through someone like 23andMe.
Yeah. So you've actually anticipated my next question, which is going to be, to you, Pam, as a physician. So there's a research side, and then there's the clinical side, right? As a physician treating patients, if someone walks in with a 23andMe report, right, and shows you, like, here's my mutations and all of that, are they actionable? Would you
Yes.
Would you prescribe and treat based on that?
Yeah, well, they're actionable, and then we would definitely have genetics counselor talk to them about their risk factors and what can be done. But yes, we do. I mean, because this is germline mutation, so it's different from having tumor mutation, which will give us a different set of things to talk about in terms of actionable mutations for treatment. But absolutely, we would look at it and definitely make decisions with the patient about that.
And we would always recommend, before you go and do a double mastectomy, I trust my data. Yeah. I know my quality control. I'd probably still get a repeat test.
Yes, absolutely.
For a dramatic surgery, it's always worth having 2 tests. Yeah.
So that gets to another issue, which I think we will increasingly see in a world, like you said, where it doesn't matter who does the genetic testing. Patients may decide to go to a place like 23andMe and pay out of pocket. Academic centers continue to build databases of their own patients. You've got like a lot going on there. So then you get to this question of who owns that data, right? And who should be releasing it or showing it to providers at certain points or whatever it might be. Let's put aside the research question, because I think that, Anne, as you described, like you sign a consent and it's, de-anonymized and all of that. But on the clinical side, this question of, people who now agree to genetic sequencing, whether it's through a company or whether it's through their physician at an academic center, what is going to happen to that data, or what needs to happen to that data to make sure that we are both crediting, the right patients, as well as being responsible for that information. We've seen the recent uproar over the Henrietta Lacks incident. So it's still uncharted territory, right, when we come to this. So just love to hear your thoughts on that.
So it's definitely uncharted territory, and it's something we think about a lot. I mean, at MD Anderson, when you're getting all of your sequencing done and all of the data that the patients are, being seen in the clinicals, that belongs to MD Anderson. It is an MD Anderson database. We do not share that data with anyone. It's their protected information. And so...
But then MD Anderson does with it, like research projects.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, there have to be IRB-approved protocols as to why you can access this information. And, of course, then, the patient's name, medical record numbers, all of those things are removed. But they can have internal research projects as long, again, as the patient has consented. And we have a lot of front-door consents when you come in to say that your information can be used in a research setting. And so we're able to do that. We certainly are not sharing that out with everybody. Again, there can be collaborations where there are agreements is set up in place to do that, and academic research agreements. In terms of what does the patient own, I mean, it's always the patient's data, so they can request it back at any time. But I have to say this interesting concept from what we learned about the Henrietta Lacks case is, if we develop a drug at MD Anderson or something goes out because of the research we did, that doesn't necessarily go back to the patient, right? And is that something that I think we're all dealing with in academic organizations as well as companies? How do we try to figure out what is it that really has to go back to the patient, and how do we credit the patients appropriately?
What's the responsible thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
So I can say, we've had very strong opinions on this. And in part from, again, prior to 23andMe, I spent 10 years on Wall Street investing in companies. And companies like Myriad, back in the day, you could get tested, but you couldn't get your raw data. And I found it so horribly offensive that you couldn't get your information back. And I think one thing I push on, and poor Stanford, because I do get care there, and I pick on them all the time, but I can't get care at Stanford without signing their consent form. So I don't have choice. They take my data whether I want it or not. Like last time I was at the dermatologist, and they're like, we have the right to use your photos however we want. And I was like, no. Even in my labor, I remember in my labor signing the forms, and they were like, we may video, we may do it. I was like, no. And I remember scratching it out, and there's this ethicist at Stanford who always criticizes us, so I love to criticize him back, Hank Greeley. And I always write on the consent form, you may not photograph me, send this to Hank Greeley. And so my motto for 23andMe has always been choice and transparency. I want to have choice, and I want to be transparent about what we're doing. And that, to me, is like the biggest issue in healthcare right now is you sign a HIPAA release and you no longer have transparency about what happened to your data. And there's this fabulous professor at Harvard who runs something called the data map, and it's just worth looking at this. And it shows all the places your data has gone. Yeah. And I think it's great, like we want to have an ecosystem and we want to be able to make these discoveries, but I would love to have that transparency back to individuals. And we actually connected with the Henrietta Lacks family, and I remember one of the best lines in the book and in the movie and that the family says is like, we would have loved to participate in research, we just wanted to know that we were doing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the missing component of so much research, and that was a huge component of 23andMe. Make people proud that they're participating. Yeah. Like I think, and we've done meetings with, people who have a fatal condition don't want like a $10 check. They don't necessarily even want the, the money or like other things that come. They want to make a difference in the world. Mm-hmm. And so make people feel good about participating in research. Like, give them that choice, and then the best thing, give them the transparency. Like, you're a super contributor. Like, you helped change, all these different therapies. Like, because of your participation, we made these discoveries. So I think that, like, the whole academic world, I advocate, like, should have a different approach, and it should be imperative that we're empowering people back with this information. It's like, all this amazing NIH research that's happened came because you all participated. Yeah. People should be proud.
Yeah, and I think at MD Anderson, for sure, you have the option to opt in or opt out of research. So I just want to make that clear. And you're definitely aware of.
Unlike Stanford.
We don't have, you don't have to send anything to the ethicist. You can opt in or opt out of research. I will say, and then we do gather all of the information from people who are participating in the research. Of course, all of that information is gathered and it goes back to research labs without any names. Mm-hmm. So who do you credit? Because, you can't go back. We're not allowed to then go backwards and say, oh, this came from so-and-so. We don't do that. It's not allowed. So you don't get to credit. I mean, obviously, we credit all of our patients in general in a big sort of way to say thank you for participating in research. It's the only way we can move forward and develop new drugs is because patients participate in clinical trials and research. But I absolutely agree. We can't go back and find a single person and say, you are the one who gave these cells to this research. That's not something that we have in place currently.
Like one thing that's been interesting for us, so in like I said, we run a phase 2 and a phase 1 study. And I've been trying to negotiate with all of those clinical trial sites to say, like, one, the patient should have access to 23andMe. They should get genetic testing. They should have access to 23andMe. And then at the end of the phase 1, I want to send them a letter thanking them. And even if they've passed away, to the family saying, thank you for participating in the phase 1, like, it made a difference. And here's the paper that came out from it. It is pulling teeth to get them, like the fact that we might contact, and there's all kinds of very valid reasons why it's so hard to contact a patient. But for me, it's like, that's part of what I'm eager to try and change. How do we have a better relationship? And even, again, one of my mom's best friends, she participated in the original Gleevec study, like a transformative drug that like has kept her alive for 30 years, 20 years. And she came to me one day. She's like, oh, did the drug do well? I was like, oh, woman, yes.
Whatever happened to that
And she's
drug?
like, oh, yeah, they always want to see me. They always want more data, more samples, but I had it did well. I'm like, very well, woman, like very well. But it's such a missed opportunity for her to be like, oh, I'm so proud, I'm alive. Because like this drug and this company and Novartis, and she's like, oh yeah, Novartis always wants to see me, but I didn't know why. And so like, that's where I really advocate, like, all of you as patients are not as scary as the healthcare industry thinks you are. And so that's what I feel like. We're the representative is like, you actually, like, we should have a relationship. We should talk.
I think that's what a direct-to-consumer company and why, like, you've had, as a company, some struggles here and there, too, right? Because the direct-to-consumer is a very different approach than one that the medical community has traditionally adopted in terms of, how care is provided, who owns that information, and how that information is used. So you mentioned clinical trials, and I think that's another interesting area when we look at genetics, and not only cancer, but other diseases as well. But how is genetics transforming the way we conduct clinical trials? Because you mentioned some of the collaborations you have with pharma companies on drug development, and that must, in terms of the database that you have and being able to make that available to them must be a huge, efficiency saver.
I think there's two things And I should also just make it clear, I love the academic medical world. I think there's a world that's going to come that's going to partner.
We're going to have a conversation later.
No, but that where you can actually really start to partner. So again, like you talk about how we can work with groups, 23andMe can do a really fabulous job of keeping people engaged. And being a front end of helping communicate with patients, like the All of Us program, like we advocate all the time, like we could return the results. We could keep people engaged. We can make it fun. We also do all this fun research on the more recreational,
Which
like
the healthcare
cilantro.
system doesn't seem to have time.
They don't have
all the
time. That's
right?
why I said, like, there's a division of labor. Like, every group can do what they do well. I also, like, I'm not executing on care in that same way. So we have to have partnerships, like 100%. Like all of these are coming together, and I do think there is a real adoption of like different worlds that are now have this opportunity to partner. So I would say like that marriage between I think a direct-to-consumer world and health systems is happening, which is actually frankly I think really exciting. So even with pharma, every pharma company now has a center that's like, oh, you know, like we're patient focused. Like, what is it? How do we engage the patient? And that's more and more, I think, an opportunity for true direct-to-consumer companies to help them have a front end. Like most pharmas don't necessarily have a relationship with individuals. So we can think about things like GLP-1s. Like we can put out a survey, which we're planning to do at some point, put out a survey, GLP-1s, get all kinds of information, engage people, like how are people responding to it, what are they doing, and then work with companies and work with everyone about that data that we are collecting. So we do studies now where we can recruit people for clinical trials, and particularly the trials that are almost impossible to enroll. So for instance, finding people who have 2 copies of the Alzheimer's variant and are over 80 and pass a cognitive screen. Those people are really hard to find, and they're hard to find because they're not showing up at the physician's office. Or other people who they might have a BRCA mutation, and they never get cancer. Those people are super interesting to study. And pharma world is now starting to come to us more and more, helping them recruit areas for like TTR amyloidosis, people potentially who, you know, with the Lp(a), like areas like that where we look at, you know, genetic risk factors. We can start to identify people and bring them into clinical trials. One of the really interesting areas as well is using polygenic risk scores to stratify a population. Meaning, if there's a cardiovascular study, I can use polygenic risk scores to look to see who's most likely to have an event. And by doing that, you have the ability to have a smaller study that's potentially shorter. So you can use genetics in all those ways. And then we are also using the data, obviously, to help people find novel targets for drug discovery. So like I said, the collaboration we had with GSK was the largest. It was a 5-year study. They renewed for 1 more year. It's been an incredibly productive study, helping them identify new programs for drug discovery.
And Pam, from your perspective as a researcher, how is it changing the way
I think it's very
trials?
important when we have all of the genetic information. For clinical trials, you can now start to either say you're only going to select patients with these particular mutations for the clinical trial, and that gives you a better chance of hitting a response rate or a clinical benefit endpoint that you can then say this is where the drug is more meaningful. The other thing you can do is you can take an all-comers. You can say everybody can enroll in the clinical trial, but then you stratify patient response rate. So you have 2 different ways of reading out the clinical benefit endpoint for all the patients and then for the specific mutation. And both are acceptable as long as you design that with the correct statistical plan for the FDA to look at and then make decisions about how to move forward. So I think it's really a game changer for clinical trials. I also love it because it takes us away from this paradigm that we can only enroll patients with bladder cancer or we can only enroll patients with pancreatic. You know, at some point we have to get to this idea that the biology may actually be the same regardless of where the cancer originated.
And be more important when it comes to a potential therapy.
Absolutely.
I think what's happening cancer has really pioneered the use of genetics. Yeah. And I think that the same way you now look at cancers, like a HER2 variant, across a number of different cancers, you're going to focus on the HER2 component of it. The rest of healthcare is going to move in that same direction. You're going to not look at, even cystic fibrosis. We start to look at it in this way. Like there's certain mutations, and certain mutations are now quite treatable. So you're going to have a number of different diseases, whether it's multiple sclerosis or heart disease, where you're going to subtype them. And then it's going to become hundreds of different types of subvariants rather than just this like broad discussion of like, oh, you have MS or you have heart disease.
Yeah. And no longer one size fits
Right.
all. Yeah. All right. So would love to open it up for questions from the audience now for these wonderful speakers here. I know that we could continue speaking, but want to give everyone a chance to chime in as well. Back there in the middle here.
Hi there. I'm a physician, scientist, oncologist. One of the amazing things with 23 is the user interface. But in oncology, we're getting all these new multi-omics data. Healthcare is becoming multimodal. How do we translate that so the general oncologist can make sense of this in the community? The AI tumor board, et cetera. What are your thoughts on where this could go in oncology with omics in multiple modalities?
So in omics right now, there's so many things, right? You have single-cell RNA sequencing, you have all the digital spatial profiling, and you have all of the genomic profiling, right? So when we take all of that, it's very much still in the research realm. But I'm hoping that groups like 23andMe and other big teams out there are going to put these data sets together. My concern is that they're very siloed data sets right now in a lot of different research organizations. So it's not really accessible for a community oncologist to look at it and say, we understand your TCR clonality, or we understand your genomic profile, and these two things go together, and this is the drug I should give you. That, to me, still is what we're lacking, is bringing all of those data sets together in order to make it have a sensible path forward.
In the back there.
I have a really simple question. Many doctors, in my experience, recommend against genetic testing.
Yeah.
Is that consistent? What's that all about?
Oh, how long do we have? It's really interesting. For instance, like there's a number of medical societies that still have statements against 23andMe. We tried to go to one of the major medical society meetings in, I think, 2019. We paid the check. We were going to have a booth, have a discussion. And they actually went as far as to return the check to us and said, you are not welcome. And even though that we're like highly applicable to their group, their industry. So
What was the reason given?
until you have a physician-mediated path, we don't want to.
So again, this idea of saying,
Yeah,
is it
it's a
actionable?
gatekeeper.
Is there?
It's a gatekeeper, yeah. I think that there's a couple things. Like I had a physician once stand up in a meeting. He's like, the biggest problem with 23andMe is you generate non-billable questions. And I think that that's actually really true. And I've had payers come up and like even this year, like 2024, saying very clearly, it is cheaper for us to treat a pulmonary embolism than it is to prevent it. And then it's, cheaper for someone, from a public health perspective to die of a heart attack than to die of cancer. So when you think about, different treatments, like I think that there's all kinds of big picture reasons how people think about prevention and genetic information. So I think that trickles down to the fact then that it has not broadly got into the societies and policymakers because it's not a system that's focused on prevention. It's really focused on you have diabetes, how are we going to treat and manage diabetes? There's so little work that goes into prevention. And doctors they're not trained on it. It is time consuming to explain and help people navigate, okay, how are you gonna change your lifestyle? Here's things that you can do. It's not a drug that you're giving people. So I do think it's been a challenge to drive acceptance. I mean, it's one of the things, like, I wish, again, if Francis was on the panel, I would ask him, like, why it's 20 plus years since the genome has been sequenced. And in other areas, technology is adopted right away. Look what's happened with AI. Yeah. Like, it's really hard to adopt genetic information, and it's not because of a lack of utility. For me, it's because of a lack of incentives in the system. And I always felt healthcare is full of people who really care. Like, you suffer going to med school, you suffer in residency, you suffer all the time, and you do. No, but you care about your patient. You're passionate. You do it because you love it. but the whole system is set up to reimburse you when you're treating a disease. And I've been told very clearly, Anne, it's so cute that you think you're going to prevent heart disease and diabetes, but no one is paid for the absence of a condition. And I think it's like, it's really hard. Like, I spend my days like, who can I partner with? Who can I align with? And frankly, the only group that I sometimes think I can align with is life insurance. Because they will also make money if you stay alive longer. But the rest of the industry, it's complicated.
Well, and it's about risk, right? And that's what genetics changes. Like,
Right.
it's a whole different type of information. It's very different from what the medical community is used to treating, which is a symptom, a broken leg, a condition.
Right.
Having genetic information really transforms, I think, the whole medical community and the way you think about disease, prevention being one, risk being one, and we're not very good at understanding what risk means and how to bill for risk or treat risk at this point.
But we looked and there should be some, we had a breakfast this morning talking about something called Duffy syndrome. So that can be common in the African American community where they show up and they look like they're neutropenic, like really low white blood cell count. And it ends up becoming really expensive. They end up having to do all kinds of follow-up tests. But it turns out it's just normal. It's just like a normal, there's just normal variation in reference ranges. To me, that's so clearly, you're creating all this kind of unnecessary suffering of these different tests you have to do on people when you could potentially just identify genetic risk factors and say, this is actually just part of normal human variation. So I think there's clear areas, and I do think we are trying to do these studies, and there's other organizations, the government is definitely helping lead this. What are the economic ROI for some of these types of tests? And I do think that data is going to come so that we're gonna be able to say, having a large genetic screen will save you money in this time frame. So I think that kind of information is coming, but it is a little bit of forcing health systems, payers to drive that adoption. It's not a natural marriage with the payer world.
As an oncologist, I will say, if you have cancer, please get genetic testing. I don't know who's telling you not to if you have cancer. If you have cancer, genetic testing of your tumor becomes very important for us to treat.
And it's remarkable. I mean, there was even a paper out recently, the number of people with lung cancer who don't get screened.
And that upsets me.
And that's a cancer that's really been...
You have to get genetic testing.
Yeah, and it's really been transformed by the targeted
yes.
therapies, right?
But if you're not doing it, and if your doctor is telling you you're not doing, please call me, because you need genetic testing for your tumor.
Well, Pam and Ann, we could continue talking, but I'm afraid our time is up, and thank you so much. It's clear, as with any revolution, we still have a long way to go, but we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you.